it's Girls Camp. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Girls Camp podcast. I'm your host, Haley Rawl, and in the spirit of spooky season, I decided today to tackle one of the spookiest topics of all, Mormonism. I'm only partially joking. I'm kind of trying to make this fit the theme because I'm actually recording at night right now. If you're watching on YouTube, I have never done this except for when I did spooky stories last year, and I'll probably record those at night later this month as well. But it worked out to record this at night. It is the month of October. Halloween is in the air. And to be fair, Mormonism can be quite spooky. I've gathered an assortment of Mormon-related things that I want to talk about today, so we're just going to do a mixed bag of Mormon and Mormon-adjacent thoughts and feelings. The first thing I wanted to address, which I have kind of touched on here and there if you've been following along closely, but I announced at the beginning of this year, in January, that I was going to be pivoting the content of Girls Camp, of this podcast, away from Mormonism, or at least from focusing so much on Mormonism. And I've actually been very self-conscious because I keep finding myself drawn back to Mormon topics. And I do think I have expanded the topics that we cover here. I do episodes where Mormonism is not the focus at all. But I'm kind of surprised, I guess it's surprised me personally, how much I still feel like I have to say about Mormon stuff. And I think a big part of it is because the world just keeps offering up things to talk about in the world of Mormonism. And I was feeling so mired in Mormon stuff, which is why I wanted to make a pivot. And I wanted to do... The reason I made it like some big announcement is because I really wanted to have a clean break from the Mormon stuff. I just felt like that would make more sense. It seemed more clear to me just to be like, you know, here's the line and I'm kind of moving on. And this self-consciousness has been around the fact that I made this big announcement and then have ended up talking about Mormon stuff still, and maybe also on a deeper level that I am still so personally interested in Mormonism and that I still want to talk about it. And that comes and goes and it depends. And I've actually unpacked this in therapy. I've talked about this a lot with Bentley, my husband, and I've realized that when the urge comes, when I have a hankering to talk about Mormonism, I'm just going to talk about Mormonism because I want to and because I have things to say about it. And then when there are times when I don't want to talk about it or there are other topics I want to address, then I'm going to do that. And so even though it didn't really turn out as planned when I made that big announcement, I am glad that I did that because I feel like it's given me more permission to show up here and talk about the things that I am currently passionate about. Oftentimes those things overlap with Mormonism. Sometimes it's Mormon focused, and sometimes it's nothing to do with Mormonism and it's more spirituality, reconstruction, etc., etc. So thanks for bearing with me as I kind of figure out the direction of this. It's very interesting having a podcast that is so connected to my personal life because it just ends up being really driven by what I'm, personally thinking, feeling, and going through. And I really love that. I feel really lucky for that. It feels like a personal journal, but then I get to share. So there's more healing and connection that comes from it. But it also can be a little bit trickier than maybe a different type of podcast or a different kind of, whatever offering anyone's putting out there because of how personal it is to me. And so it's not always so clear cut as I would sometimes like it to be. One of the things that makes me feel most misunderstood as the person that I am on the internet talking about Mormon related topics is it all kind of boils down to the favorite thing that people will say to people who talk about Mormonism on the internet, which is, why are you making this your whole personality? And it's crazy that that still has a little bit of a something that kind of bothers me. And I actually talked about this in January when I said I was shifting away from it, because I started to kind of sense some truth in that. And I sensed that I was feeling triggered when people said that, because I did want to move beyond Mormonism. And I didn't want to be the person who made ex-Mormonism their whole personality. Where I sit now, I think that there is some truth to that. There is some truth to the fact that at a certain point, you maybe need to set your sights on something different, kind of choose to move into different things, which I am to an extent doing. And I also think that the way I relate to Mormonism now, yes, I've lived it. Yes, it is personal to me. And it is also just a fascinating subject matter that continues to fascinate, that continues to offer opportunities to look at the human experience and the human condition as a whole, whether it's a Mormon topic that then enlightens a human experience, or a human experience that I can sometimes distill through little Mormon anecdotes or Mormon facets of things. It just still feels really useful in that sense, as far as unpacking this whole thing called life that we're living. And I think the misunderstood thing is that my relationship to talking about this really has shifted quite a bit, and it feels a lot less heavy and personal, and it feels a lot more like this niche topic that I've become really fascinated in. And obviously, being an ex-Mormon is not my whole personality, but also the part of my personality that it is, I really embrace that. And I don't think that that is, different people will embrace that differently or reject that differently, and every person has a different journey with that. But for me, that is a part of me, and that's okay. And I actually really like that it's a part of me because of all of those things that I previously mentioned. The first topic of discussion, or I guess the second that I want to dive into with you today, is what's been happening on the internet after the very tragic, very devastating shooting that happened at an LDS church building in Michigan. First and foremost, and I would hope this goes without saying, but I will say it very loud and very clear. Well, not loud, but clear and straightforward. I do not condone violence in any way, shape, or form. I think that what happened is completely horrifying. I think that gun violence is particularly horrifying when we have these weapons that can really create so much devastation, that can hurt so many people all at once. I don't think anyone should live in fear. I don't think anyone should face the threat of violence when they are attending church or attending school or out and about in the public. I do not condone violence whatsoever. And I don't think that, hopefully, almost any of us do. In response to the shooting, after a few days, there started to be a pretty strong thing happening online where it seemed that members of the Mormon Church were starting to point the finger of blame for this attack on anti-Mormons. I'm putting air quotes on that. And that's a pretty big umbrella that I want to break down a little bit. But a really big segment of the anti-Mormons that were being blamed are ex-Mormon content creators like myself. And I've talked to many people in the space of ex-Mormon content creation who have had similar things said to them in comments, DMs, etc., basically saying you are at least partially responsible for what happened because you are fueling hate through this anti-Mormon rhetoric that you are sharing on the internet. This first came to my door because I do a Sunday check-in thing where I have an anonymous submission box, and I did that the Sunday following the shooting, so a week after it happened, right? I don't think it was the day of. I think it was a week after. And to my anonymous submission box, within like 30 minutes of me putting it up, I had probably 35-ish submissions of people saying, this is your fault that this happened. You're part of the problem. You need to stop. You are fueling, inciting violence and hatred. And then amongst those comments were also some just standard trolling. One of them said, you look like you have a rank coochie. I don't know if only to beep that out. I mean, I swear on this podcast, something about coochie like feels particularly vulgar, and it's almost like trying to avoid complete vulgarity. Anyway, that was a comment. You look musty or something. There was just a mass kind of trolling thing toward me in my anonymous submission box. And I actually had a handful of people reach out and say, oh, this almost seems like it was all the same person because it was all so quickly. And that could be true. I kind of think it got posted somewhere like, oh, Girls Camp Podcast has this anonymous thing. Let's all flood her anonymous submission box with these types of comments. Interesting that I didn't get a single one of those comments on my non-anonymous option to submit like questions or thoughts or feelings for me to respond to. They were all submitted anonymously, which I think says something. But I realized when that happened, that's kind of when I clued into this happening and then started talking to other people. And then I made a video about it and got a handful of comments from that video. And I just want to read you one comment and one DM I got just to give you a flavor of kind of the root of this argument. This comment was from Saints Respond on a video I made where I kind of in a nutshell just said, this is actually, not even actually, this is so scary and devastating. And I have family and friends who are active Mormons who are attending church. I'm so sad that this has happened. I'm grieving with my Mormon community. And the Mormon church continues to do harm, especially to marginalized groups. There's currently happening right now, the church is legally, actively fighting against trans rights, for example. And I mentioned that. And I was kind of speaking to the complexity of being an ex-Mormon, where on one hand, obviously, like there's a lot of feelings towards the church and the harm that it causes to us and to marginalized groups. And there's also this grief and this feeling of community that I felt of like, these are still my people. And I also was feeling a lot of defensiveness toward Christians who were attacking Mormonism, because I think that's hypocritical to attack Mormons for having strange beliefs when the beliefs are not all that different from Christianity generally. That was the gist of my video. And this is what Saints responded. Living up to your name, Saints Respond. They responded a lot, actually. They responded this, and then were responding a lot to other comments in the thread on my video. So, Saints do be responding. So you can still spew the church is a cult rhetoric and then claim impunity because you didn't mean for bad things to happen. This podcast and others like it are deliberate attacks on faith to dismantle it, revel in dismantling it, and then masquerade it as a, quote, safe space for others with extreme bad will for the LDS church and the members in it. She's a confused individual and takes no responsibility for her rhetoric or claims against the church. And then here was a DM. Please stop contributing to this hateful dialogue against people just trying to peacefully practice their faith. To fear my children's lives as we attend church is deeply frightening as a mother. I know certain beliefs of the Latter-day Saint faith have hurt you, but from faithful members, we are just trying to live our faith peacefully. I fear anti-Mormon rhetoric can fuel people like the man in Michigan on Sunday. You are certainly free to your opinion, but demonizing practicing Christians in this world can be dangerous, as we have seen. This is not about me personally. I am just one of the faces that people attach to ex-Mormon content creators. And I'm still working on really internalizing that, though I do believe that rationally. This is not about me. This is about this online persona, especially from people who are, people like this who obviously are not a fan of Girls Camp. I understand they have even less of an understanding of who I am. I mean, even people who listen to my podcast, you know who I am to an extent, right? But people who just see like clips of me online or whatever, they have a very limited understanding of who I am and what I stand for. And they also just kind of see anyone speaking critically about Mormonism, I think, at least to some extent, as being very antagonistic towards the church and trying to tear it down. I kind of kept going through phases of like, this kind of would get into my psyche as I would read a comment and be like, wait, I know that's not true, but that's just such a huge thing to be accused of. And when you're grieving this horrific attack on the community you came from, and then someone saying, this is actually partially your fault, I really wanted to think about it. Like I wanted to, again, I knew it was illogical to a large extent, but I wanted to consider. And at the same time, I also, anytime I would kind of realize, okay, this is projection or this is where this is coming from, then I would get another comment or DM and it would kind of throw me back. But as I was working through this, I got this DM and it was very helpful for me. So I really appreciate it. And I'm going to read it to you in full. This person said, please stop contributing to this hateful dialogue. No. This was also a member of the church, but singing a very different tune. They said, I wanted to just give you a few words of encouragement. I'm an active member of the church who chooses to believe in God while recognizing that there are things the church organization does/promotes that I don't align myself with. I'm also a therapist, so please try not to accept any blame that others may place on you for sharing commentary on your experiences with the church. From a trauma perspective, victims and observers of trauma by nature will instinctually place blame for tragedies and wrongdoings on safe people. In the face of confusing tragedies, like the recent shooting, it's a lot easier for people to say, it's this person's/group's fault, you or other critics of the church, and they're normal, safe members of society. And so all we need to do is convince them to stop sharing negative opinions on the church, and then we can prevent future tragedies. So they're saying it's easier to do that than to admit that someone did an evil, terrible thing that was fueled by hatred, mental illness, how someone was raised, easy access to firearms, etc. And there might not have been any way to prevent it. I am not in any way suggesting it's okay for people to blame you for this attack. I'm only drawing attention to a very common trauma response. They recognize you as a safe person, and it's always easier to place blame on a safe person than to address that this attack was probably the result of a variety of terrible circumstances, including limited gun control laws, dangerous partisan rhetoric, and just a bad person who did an evil, terrible thing. While I don't agree with every opinion you share on your podcast, I appreciate you being willing to share your experiences. I've had many similar ones. It can be tough as both a member and someone who is not a part of the church to sometimes share the negative experiences. So I always appreciate hearing you share your side. Just know I appreciate what you do. What a gift that DM was for me. Coming from both someone who considers themselves an active Mormon, it felt very nice to hear that from someone in the community still who was affected by this tragedy, and also someone who is a therapist and obviously knows their shit. And I really appreciated the way that they broke that down for me. And it makes a lot of sense, right? I think we see this happening a lot right now. And, it's always happened where when scary things happen, it feels a lot easier to say it is this group of people's fault. So if we can protect ourselves from that group of people, convince that group of people, as this person said, to stop doing certain things, then something like this will never happen. That creates at least some sense of order, at least some sense of understanding, rather than acknowledging this was a mentally ill person who had access to guns and he did this terrible thing. How do we prevent that? Well, actually, there are ways to at least make that more difficult to happen, like gun control laws, etc. But for someone in a Mormon community, maybe especially someone who has certain political beliefs about guns, for example, that might not be the easiest route to go. It would probably be easier, especially when there's probably already animosity toward ex-Mormons who are critiquing the church. It's easier just to say, oh, I've always felt a certain way about those people, and now I can outlet this grief and this anger onto this person. Many people think that OCD is a matter of hyper-organization and making sure everything is clean all the time, but it can actually target the things that matter to you the most, like your spirituality, your beliefs, and your morals. Particularly relevant for what we talk about here at Girls Camp is a type of OCD called religious OCD or scrupulosity, which is characterized by intrusive thoughts and compulsive behaviors related to religious beliefs and moral values. It can look like obsessive thoughts, worrying about committing sins, a fear of violating religious doctrines, or intrusive images or doubts about religious beliefs. And/or it can look like compulsive behaviors such as repetitive prayer and confession, repetitive rituals, excessive research on religious texts or doctrine, and avoiding situations that might trigger religious anxiety. Fortunately, though, you do not need to suffer forever because OCD and religious OCD are highly treatable, which is where NoCD comes in. NoCD is the world's leading treatment provider for OCD, and their licensed therapists specialize in ERP, or exposure and response prevention, which is the gold standard for OCD treatment. Regardless of where you are on the religious or spiritual spectrum, their licensed therapists will respect your personal beliefs while also helping you heal from OCD. The sessions themselves are 100% virtual, and they are also covered by insurance for over 155 million Americans. So if you're worried about cost, check with your insurance. You are able to access support outside of sessions, so you are never alone on this journey. If you think you might be dealing with religious OCD, you can book a free 15-minute call today at nocd.com. That's NOCD.com. I was talking to a fellow ex-Mormon content creator about this, and we were kind of breaking it down, and they pointed out something. They just said it so succinctly in a way that I really appreciated, where they said they have been seeing so many comments about the shooter that were saying this person is mentally ill. He's an ex-Marine, I think, so a veteran, and basically saying this person was very vulnerable and was indoctrinated by anti-Mormon sentiment. Oh, and the anti-Mormon sentiment is coming from ex-Mormons, basically pointing out that it feels like some people are humanizing the shooter more so than they feel able to humanize ex-Mormon content creators. And that's a really interesting thing to think about psychologically, because I feel in some ways so similar to Mormons, way more similar to Mormons than someone who has never been Mormon. And I actually had someone comment this on the YouTube video of the episode last week, where I was talking about good ghost experiences. And they said there's something called the horseshoe theory, where you think that people like Mormons and ex-Mormons would be completely on opposite sides of the spectrum, but it's more like a horseshoe. And you actually can find yourself like much more similar in beliefs, even though you are seemingly opposite. And maybe this is an example of that, and how bizarre it felt that they could be finding more in common almost with the person who did the shooting than with people who had Mormon experiences and are now talking about them. The church also, well, not the church, it was people in the church. I don't know who started it, but there was a GoFundMe that was started for the family of the person who shot up the church building. I believe he left a wife because he died. The police came and they shot him and he died on the scene. I believe he had one son, maybe two children, and a wife is who he left behind. And so someone in the church decided to start a GoFundMe, and I think they ended up raising like $300,000 or something, like a significant amount of money for the shooter's family. And I think that that's really beautiful in a sense. I do. And I also think it's complicated. And I don't want to cast judgment necessarily on, again, maybe that was something that felt really healing and like a form of forgiveness in a sense. And I can't speak to that. As an outside-ish party, I did find it very interesting. I mean, I'm sure the families were being taken care of very well. I was connected through Chelsea Homer, a fellow person in the space. I shared someone that we could all Venmo. I Venmo'd this person that was helping the families of those affected, the people at the church building. So I'm also not saying those are mutually exclusive. I was struggling to kind of put my finger on why it felt a bit strange to me to see that. And maybe there was a bit of virtue signaling sense that I felt. And maybe the reason I felt that way is because I don't think the GoFundMe was started by the actual victims of the violence, the people that died and their families and the people that were there. I think that's maybe the root of it, is because I wonder how the victims would feel about that, about like kind of the community at large forgiving this person if maybe they haven't yet or they don't want to. Although this person's wife and children aren't culpable for what this man did. So maybe it's completely disconnected. I don't know. I'm still ruminating a bit on that. But the reason I brought it up is because I do think it supports this idea that there is a sort of benefit of the doubt or humanization given to the shooter in a way that it's maybe not being extended to people who actually had nothing to do with the violence that actually happened. Criticism of systems, of institutions, of religions is not the same as inciting violence, period. It's not. And by that logic, no one could criticize systems of power without being accused of inciting violence toward the people that they're critiquing or people who are part of those organizations or religions that they're critiquing. Mormon Stories did a really good, thorough response panel about this response from the LDS community, saying that ex-Mormon content creators are to blame. And they did a really good job breaking down like the difference between ex-Mormon and anti-Mormon. And I think that's a really good distinction to call out here as well. Being ex-Mormon means that you've left the church. And, you know, being an ex-Mormon content creator, you've left the church, now you're talking about it, probably critiquing it, sharing experiences. Being anti-Mormon means you are trying to tear down or harm the church. And the irony there is that ex-Mormons, whether directly or indirectly, I think are actually advocating for Mormons. Ex-Mormons are oftentimes the ones pointing out where Mormons who are women or queer Mormons or Mormons who are people of color are not being treated as equals, or where the church is failing its own members. And oftentimes the members can't do that because they will face repercussions. Ex-Mormons can because they've removed themselves from the repercussions that they could face, at least within the system. And so in a roundabout way, ex-Mormons are kind of advocating for Mormons. And yeah, they're not necessarily asking for it, but I think you can draw parallels. I mean, John DeLynn and I talked about this. John DeLynn is the one who runs Mormon Stories, and he said a lot of changes he believes have been made because ex-Mormons have put pressure on the church in a way that members couldn't. And that's maybe part of why that insult is like so ouchy, is because as someone who talks about this, the last thing I want is for Mormons to have a worse experience in the church. I want it to be better than it was when I was in it. And that's a big part of why I talk about it. Not the primary reason why, although I do think John DeLynn is probably one of the most misunderstood people I've ever met, because he cares so deeply about the church and he does want it to be better. And I've said this before, that's not my primary aim, is to like fix an institution I'm no longer a part of. My primary aim is to be a safe space for people who have left it. Like, that's more my aim. However, I want the church to get better because the church doesn't seem like it's going away. And I'd so much rather it become better and more transparent and less harmful. In that Mormon Stories panel, they pointed out a very interesting hypocrisy that is also very timely, because Charlie Kirk, who was recently assassinated, before he died this year in 2025, he said about the Catholic Pope that the Pope is a Marxist and is unfit to represent Christ. I will track down the clip and put it in the show notes so you can listen to the actual clip, because people, when it comes to Charlie Kirk, I feel like people are always like, out of context. So I'll share the clip and you can judge from the context. But it seems pretty clear he was saying he doesn't like the Pope. And he was not accused of inciting violence against the Pope or against Catholics. And yet, when this shooting happens, ex-Mormons are all of a sudden now being ones that are inciting violence. And it just feels like there's this double standard, or maybe just these blind spots where, and I'm not saying every Mormon agrees with Charlie Kirk. I'm just saying that, you know, it's a pretty interesting parallel to make, when I do think there are a lot of conservative Mormons, at least from what I saw on Instagram after Charlie Kirk was assassinated, that really admire Charlie Kirk. And there was violence actually at a Catholic school, and it wasn't blamed on Charlie Kirk for fueling hatred or inciting violence. So it just feels like there's a double standard there. Next Mormon topic: are Mormons becoming more lax about their discipleship as I would have called it back in my day as a Mormon, are Mormons relating to the church in a less devout, less orthodox way than before. I, for one, have been noticing a shift. I think that since I've left the church, maybe I've just noticed it more, like I'm more sensitive to it. But I do think it started happening from my noticing in probably the past 5 years or so, and has kind of increasingly accelerated, of Mormons who are Mormon. They consider themselves active, they attend church, but they don't do all the Mormon things. One of the biggest examples of this, the kind of epitome of this type of Mormonism, is the Secret Lives of Mormon Wives cast members, where they say they're Mormon, they drink coffee, and they talk about drinking coffee. They don't wear their garments, and they don't seem to think that that's a problem. They are picking and choosing the ways in which they show up as Mormons, but they still go to church. Mayci Neeley of The Secret Lives of Mormon Wives, she's actually one of my favorite on the cast. I really like Mayci, and she just released a book, so she's doing a book tour right now. I will probably end up eventually reading her book. I enjoy a memoir. I feel like they're a pretty easy read, and yeah, I'm curious to hear more about her story in her own words, but NPR pulled a clip from her talking at a stop on her book tour that I want to share with you and then share my thoughts on it. Okay, here's the clip. Yeah, so she's basically saying that the Mormon wives are doing a good thing in showing that you don't have to be perfect and you can still be Mormon. I'm of two minds about this, as always I have been. Part of me says, go you. Any amount of autonomy you can take back, take it. Any amount of, I don't care actually what the church says, I'm happy about and I applaud. And it's a bit weird to me that you would want to be Mormon but not do most of the Mormon things, mostly because Mormonism is so intent on letting people know you have to do the Mormon things in order to be a good practicing Mormon who can make it to heaven someday. There's just an inherent dissonance, I think, in the way that me and my own brain operates in wanting to be part of the church, but not actually wanting to do a lot of what the church is telling you to do. But I can understand this kind of cultural Mormonism of people who want to attend church. They see it as a way of being close to a higher power, being close to Jesus. It is their way that they've grown up with, that they are familiar with. So they take the good parts and they leave the bad. Well, there was a very interesting study that the Salt Lake Tribune just did a recap of, where they are kind of breaking down how members of the church are relating to Mormonism. The article says, active Latter-day Saints are increasingly abandoning orthodox views. Research suggests that the LDS community is diversifying, moving from a previously uniform group characterized by devoutness and conservatism to a more complex spectrum of beliefs. They decided to put believers into 4 different categories. There are devout traditionalists, those who pretty much are just going to do, they believe everything the church says and they do it. There are adaptive believers who attend church regularly, but they might be less consistent with prayer and scripture study. Interestingly, roughly half of that group believe the faith is the one true church. So adaptive believers are already questioning what I think is one of the most fundamental principles of the church, that it is the only true church. The third group they've identified is cultural Mormons. These are the people who have the lowest rate of religious participation. They basically still believe in God and heaven, and they see Mormonism as part of their cultural identity. I would think Mayci probably falls in group 3. Not even group 2. Like, she seems like more of a cultural Mormon who's kind of like, yeah, like, I believe in God and Jesus, and Mormonism is my avenue for that. The last group is in-betweeners. These are people who have low belief in God and heaven, yet they are more likely than cultural Mormons to attend church, read scriptures, etc. So that's a really interesting group of people. I would guess this is a group of people who are the most likely to end up leaving the church someday because they're maybe questioning those fundamental beliefs, but like still feeling this need to participate in full. I'll also link this in the show notes because they have a graph of how these groups have shifted over time since 2007 to now. But the most significant thing I want to talk about is that the devout traditionalists used to make up 62% of the people who they've done this survey with, and that has dropped to 25% by 2024. So from 62% to 25% of the people responding to the survey, that is such a significant downward trend in people who are devout and traditional in their beliefs about Mormonism. And then those other three groups have all trended upward to some extent. And it was really kind of validating, I guess, and just fascinating to see hard data supporting this feeling that I've sensed and this thing that I've kind of seen of realizing that Mormonism really is changing. It's changing as the core of its membership is changing. But is the church proper, the leadership of the church, the official policies and doctrines of the church, are they changing in tandem with that shift of the church population? I don't think so, from what I can tell. And maybe there's some interesting data on that. That might be a difficult thing to track. But as far as the things being preached over the pulpit, it doesn't feel like there is at all a shift in, hey, these things are not actually that important. Actually, slight correction. There have been some significant shifts in things like the garments becoming a little bit easier to work with as they've made them tank top garments now. There is now more leniency officially toward tattoos and second piercings and things like that. So I do think that that matches up to an extent, but I do think when it comes to things like wearing the garments, not drinking coffee, there has actually been almost a digging in of heels in response to this shift in the church population. And I'm just really fascinated to see at what point, if ever, those two things will really collide. And as the church becomes more strict on certain things, but the membership becomes less, they care less about what the church is telling them to do, what that's going to do to, if it will be that the population of the church ends up affecting the leadership, or if just more people will leave. It will just be really interesting to watch unfold. This next question I've been ruminating on came to my DMs by way of the fellas over at the Stick of Joseph. The Stick of Joseph is a Mormon apologist account on Instagram. They've responded to some of my stuff before. They went on Mormon Stories and debated John DeLynn on Mormon Stories. And yeah, you can go check them out if you'd like and form your own opinions on them. But they've tried to engage with me a number of times by stitching a video. They did a YouTube video responding to a video I did, and I've just really not been interested in taking the bait. But they asked me a question in my DMs, which to their credit, I have reflected on. They said, "Hey, Haley," this was out of the blue, by the way, though this was recently, so this was after the shooting. I don't know if that's relevant or not. "Hey, Haley, I have a question for you. Do you think the church's impact is at very least a 51% net positive on the world?" I saw the message, so I'm sure it showed up as read, and I didn't respond. And then a few hours later, as if I might misunderstand the question, they laid it out even more clearly and said, meaning 51% positive impact, 49% negative impact, or do you think it has a greater net negative? I did not respond to them. So I don't know. Maybe they'll watch this. Maybe I'll clip this and tag them so they can see my response here. Like I said, I did reflect on this and I did take this question seriously, and I see what they're trying to get at. My first response to the question is not a direct response, but it is the first thing that came to mind for me, which is, does it matter so much how much good something is doing if it is built on lies and deceit and unethical actions? Because I do think the church is built on lies and deceit, and I think the founders of the church were doing unethical things. And so it almost makes the question itself, while not worth answering, and I will answer it, it is something I think worth considering. And I think it's worth noting that this question is directly avoiding, is the church true? Are the truth claims of the church, the foundation of the church, are those sound? And instead saying, well, does it do net positive or net negative? I think whether the church is doing more bad than good is a difficult thing to quantify. However, I do think that the church does more harm than it does good. And the easiest way I can break that down is thinking about, to whom is the church doing good or doing bad? And to a straight, white, conservative male, the church is probably doing a decent amount of good. It's probably providing community and purpose and meaning. And I'm not saying that conservative, straight, white males don't deserve good things and community and meaning and purpose. I think that they do. However, let's take a queer woman, for example. Do I think the church is doing a net good for a queer woman raised in the church? No, I do not, because I think the church has policies and cultural practices and doctrine that are repressive toward queer people and towards women. They put women in boxes of what roles they can fulfill in this life and in the theoretical afterlife. And for queer people especially, it certainly is a net negative, because it teaches them ultimately at its core to think that they cannot be who they are without living in sin and being punished now and into eternity. And so although it may do good for some people, and although it may even do good for people of all identities, I don't think that I can say that something is a net positive when it causes so much harm for so many people. And you could get into, well, how many people are this way in the church and how many people are that way? But to me, it's more the principle of the matter, that if it is only doing good for a certain already privileged group of people, then I don't think it's actually doing a net good at all. And I think there are also tons of arguments that could be made about how it's actually maybe not doing as much good as we think, even for the privileged people in the church, and how it still is detrimental to men and also puts men in boxes. It gives men more power, yes, but it ultimately is causing harm to society by putting those men in positions of power, making men think that they are more powerful than women or that they have authority over women just by being a man. I don't even think that's just bad for society and for women in this scenario. I think that's also bad ultimately for men. And I think it's bad for the harmony of all things. So yes, I think that it does do a net negative. Also, even if I were to say that it does 51% positive and only 49% negative, so ultimately it's 2% more positive than negative, that doesn't negate the negative that it does do. And that doesn't make it not worth addressing the negative and the harm, right? And I don't know where they were going with that question. Maybe I'll DM them back and keep you updated, return and report. But I'm assuming it was sort of this gotcha, like, well, if you can't say it's doing a net negative, then why are you here critiquing it or whatever, which that's conjecture. Maybe that wasn't the point of that question. Maybe they were asking it in good faith. I kind of doubt it. Either way, it's not this black and white, well, it does 51% positive, so there you have it, folks. I even think a lot of people would say, not a lot, but I think some people who talk out against Mormonism might even say it does do 51% positive. But again, that doesn't really change anything, I don't think. let's lighten things up a little bit. I decided to do one of my favorite activities that I have not done in a long time and peruse the ex-Mormon Reddit page. I used to do this fairly frequently. I hadn't done it in a minute, and I had bricked my phone. If you don't know, brick, you can lock yourself out of certain apps. So I was locked out of Instagram and TikTok, which I do every night before I get in bed, which is fantastic. Highly recommend. But I can still get on Reddit. I actually deleted the Reddit app from my phone, but I can get on it through Safari. Anyway, I have set good limits on Reddit, and I only look at things when I am looking at book reviews, movie reviews, whatever. I don't need to prove myself, but I am just saying Reddit can get nasty. I like looking at things that are not nasty on Reddit. So I was reading on the ex-Mormon Reddit, and I read this submission entry post. There you go. I read this post that I thought was so funny, and I had to share it with you. Someone said, I got blocked from LDS Tools because we moved to a new country and I updated our address to show an adult toy store. I have no regrets. Quick context for those who don't know, LDS Tools is the app where the church tracks its membership, who you are, where you live, the kids that you have. It's basically a directory of every member of the church. Full context. Moved out of Utah to a different country. The ward leadership knows where I am with the church, and I know where the church is with not respecting personal boundaries. Rather than refusing to give our new address and going through the rigmarole of them contacting family members and guilting us, I preemptively updated our address so we could just say we took care of it already. I gave them the address of an adult sex toy store. Inappropriate? Yes, but so is their lack of respect for personal boundaries, which is the message I'm trying to send. Anyway, I don't know if they sent out a local Elders Quorum president or Relief Society president or just Google mapped the address, but I know they checked because I am now blocked from updating on LDS Tools. It says I must call the ward clerk to make any updates. The bishop is now messaging my wife for updates instead. I'm going to picture the idea of sending them the address of a strip club. I love a silly little prank as rebellion. And this one is so funny. I wish I thought of this myself. I actually had a scenario, long story short, and trying to protect the people in the story, but friends of ours were in a ward with, I'll just say a family member of ours. And they moved, and they are ex-Mormon, but they have not removed their records. And they didn't want the church to know where they moved because, like this person said, the church will find them, send missionaries, send people from the ward to get them to try and come to the ward, whatever. And so this family member of mine, extended family member, reached out to me and was like, hey, I know you're friends with these people. Can you give me their address? And I was like, no, I'm not going to give you their address. I actually said that. I mean, I was kind about it, but I was like, no, I don't feel comfortable doing that. I found that so bizarre to put me in the middle of, but that's just an example of kind of this intense tracking that the Mormon church and sometimes Mormons themselves do of members. And so updating the address to a sex toy shop is so funny. This was the top comment on that Reddit post. The missionaries spent 3 hours in the store looking for you and having life-changing experiences. I will say a sex toy shop is a little bit jarring. Maybe jarring is the wrong word. And you know what? I haven't gone to one in a while. Did I go to one? I've only gone to one literally once in my life, besides when I was probably in middle school and I went into a Spencer's at the mall. Does anyone remember Spencer's? Maybe that's still a thing. It's kind of like a Hot Topic from the front. It looks like a Hot Topic, but when you go in there, they have a lot of sex toys. And as a middle schooler, I was very scandalized and a bit traumatized. And then I went to another one, like kind of just for fun, which is kind of embarrassing now to admit, as I must have been recently out of the church or something, not just to be like, whoa, to like go gawk at things, but I think we were like, oh, we've never been to a sex toy store. Let's go check it out. And I felt a little bit prudish, though I don't consider myself a prude. I was like, oh, wow, this is a bit more than I bargained for, but I'd like to go back now as I have become increasingly sexually liberated, I'd like to think. That might be a good litmus test. Go into a sex toy store and see if you can do it without blushing. Another Reddit post from that evening perusal that had me thinking, someone said, "Nobody in my family wants to know why I left the Mormon church. Can anybody else relate to the experience of having 0 active Mormons asking why you left the church? I was raised Mormon, and my entire immediate and extended family are LDS. Not one of them has ever asked me why I left. It's kind of creepy to me, honestly. They all just pretend like I'm still a member. If the roles were reversed, I would be pretty invested in trying to understand why my family member chose to walk a different path, especially if they were my child. I would want to know." When I told my family that I left the church, they did ask me why. And at the time, I had thought it through and I decided to not have that conversation. Maybe I didn't feel ready for it. Maybe I felt like having that conversation, saying my reasons for leaving would be offensive. Maybe I thought that having that conversation or really stating my reasons for leaving would feel inherently offensive to them because my reasons for leaving are essentially that I don't think it's true, that I think Joseph Smith made it all up. I mean, I could word it differently, obviously, but it didn't feel like a conversation I was ready to have because I felt like that would bring up a lot of hard feelings on all sides, right? And I just wanted to be able to say, I actually said when they asked me that, I said, I no longer believe that it's true, probably in the same way you do believe it's true. I no longer believe it's true and right for me. And I very intentionally set a boundary around that. And now I kind of don't know how to walk that boundary back because I have been thinking about what this person said, which is how odd it can feel. And it's okay. I think in part, it's not like this plagues me all the time. And I think this is part of what I talked about with Julie Hanks when I kind of said to her, like, it's hard to have loved ones who are still so active in a church that I think is harmful. And I would add now, in context of this conversation, that I also think is built on lies that can be disproven. I really do think that there are certain things that you can point people to that it's not always going to lead to someone leaving the church necessarily, but I think that there are certain things that I think people in my life maybe have not seen or read or things that they don't know. And I was kind of saying this to Julie and she was like, it's not your job, essentially. She's like, let them have their own journey. And I really do believe that. I don't think I would never at this point just go to a family member and be like, you should read this and do you know this, this, and this. I just don't think it's productive. I think they know if they want to know, they know where to find me, especially me, because they can look up my podcast and listen. I have an episode of why I left the church. So it's a bit different in my circumstance, but I do think it is strange, not speaking personally now necessarily, but it's strange to find out that something is not true and can be disproven. And again, that's not necessarily subjective, right? Because I do think there are people who know the things I know and have read the things I read and do still believe. But it's a bit weird to feel like you have figured something out and you think something is no longer true and you could just like tell people that and they are still like maybe living under a false premise. Again, I want to be so clear. I really, really, really dislike still to this day, even though I think there can be, sometimes is, maybe even oftentimes is truth to the fact that ex-members of the church tend to know more about the church than members of it. And this was actually something that was discussed in that Mormon Stories panel about anti-Mormonism and what is an anti-Mormon. And they were saying one of the original anti-Mormons is a woman named Fawn Brody, who wrote a really thorough biography of Joseph Smith called No Man Knows My History. And maybe she did leave the church. Oh, she was excommunicated in 1946 because of her biography, No Man Knows My History. Okay, yes, I do remember that. So she was excommunicated and labeled as an anti-Mormon for what she had written about Joseph Smith, which has since been proven to be correct. She had written a piece of historical scholarship that checks out. She had sources and she knew her stuff and she wrote it down and was thereby labeled an anti-Mormon and excommunicated from the church. How is it anti-Mormon to share the history of Joseph Smith's life? How is it anti-Mormon to simply share the information about who Joseph Smith was and what he did? It really brings into question this idea of anti-Mormonism. And why did I get down this tangent? This is probably why I don't record at night, because my brain tends to be a little bit less sharp than in the daytime. I think the point I was trying to get at is that there is a lot of experts and academics and research that can pretty clearly disprove certain things about the Mormon church. And, we see this, there's apologists who kind of find their ways of, responding or whatever. There are ways to get around it, but I do oftentimes wonder how much the average practicing member of the church knows, or maybe even how much they care, because maybe they don't really care. But if they don't care, why don't they care? And why do they not want to engage more with that information and with people sharing that information? It does feel like kind of in general, it's more of like this interesting compartmentalization that this Redditor was pointing out. Last but not least, I just started a new book just today, but I did a lot of driving today and I went to the gym, which is usually when I listen to my books. So I've gotten a feel for it. It is called Sister Wife, a memoir of faith, family, and finding freedom. It is written by Christine Brown Woolley, who is the third wife of Cody Brown from the TLC show Sister Wives. I watched Sister Wives. It's about a polygamist family. I watched it growing up. I remember watching Sister Wives, and then I kind of lost track. I've seen in the news, I think I'm kind of not intentionally not looking it up because I want to read it now through this book. But I know this woman divorced her husband. I don't believe she's living in polygamy anymore. But I actually got an email from Christine, the author, her book publicist. This was months ago. And they were like, hey, this book is coming out. Would you like to do an interview? And I was stoked about it. And it just didn't end up panning out. Her schedule filled up. So I wasn't able to get an interview with her. I would love so much to talk to her. Although already reading her book, I don't know where she's landed as far as like what she believes now, but it's really interesting just to hear her firsthand experience of polygamy. And I am feeling a niche interest developing in polygamy, which I'm shocked hasn't happened yet for me. Not necessarily in early polygamy, Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, although it's obviously connected, but in the polygamist branches of Mormonism. I mean, that's part of Mormonism. It's no longer officially part of Mormonism, but many of these polygamist offshoots, they still read the Book of Mormon. They actually believe kind of more in what Mormonism originally stood for than the modern LDS church does now, because the church was originally, polygamy was very foundational to the church when it first started. And so I'm getting really interested in it. And also, this was before I started the book. I got a text from my friend, Chloe. She had read the book and she loved it. She's now watching Sister Wives. After she texted me, I was on the treadmill at the gym and this woman came up to me and she's like, oh, I'm a listener of the podcast. We started chatting and she told me that she grew up in a polygamist family. So I might interview her. I'm trying to work it out with her, but I've been wanting to do that since I started the podcast. And I'm excited to really dig into that world of modern day polygamy, of people who are still practicing polygamy right now and what that looks like, and people who have left polygamist Mormonism and how they've deconstructed. So stay tuned for that. And if you want to read along with me, Sister Wife by Christine Brown Woolley. And I probably will end up rewatching the TLC series as well. I remember it being very interesting. It just feels a bit daunting because I think it was like years and years and years of the show. So Who knows if I can make it all the way through, but I will keep you updated on that front. And I'm sure we will have much to talk about on that front as well. Thank you for joining me. I hope it wasn't too spooky of a Mormon breakdown today on the podcast, but it feels nice to get that all out there. Can't wait to hear your thoughts and feelings on all of these things. I really do love hearing your thoughts and feelings on these things. I think that's one of the reasons I've been loving YouTube so much and putting my content on YouTube. I am now fully converted to YouTube as a consumer. Like almost all of my podcast listening. I mean, I will listen in the car still, but I love to be able to have it up on YouTube, like while I'm doing things around the house on my iPad. I strongly recommend YouTube for podcast consumption. I love the comment section. It just feels like there's actually a conversation happening. It's not just podcasting. Sometimes just feels like brick wall talking. So anyway, there's a plug for YouTube, Girls Camp Podcast. I'm on Instagram at Girls Camp Podcast, TikTok, Haley Rawl. And if you are interested in more content, especially more Mormon content, we were talking about the Mormon stuff and how I'm navigating that here on the main feed. You're still going to get some of that here, as I said, but a lot of that is happening over on the Patreon. It's patreon.com/girlscamp. There's 2 bonus episodes a month over there, and we have a grand old time if you're interested. If you enjoyed the podcast, please leave a rating and review. It would mean the world. Subscribe on YouTube if you're watching on YouTube. And thanks for being here. Can't wait to talk to you next week. Bye.